The galaxy had long forgotten the meaning of silence. For centuries, war drums had echoed through space, reverberating from the iron domes of planetary fortresses to the void of abandoned star lanes. Civilizations rose and crumbled beneath the heel of the apex dominion, an empire forged not through wisdom or trade but raw, merciless dominance. Their warlords were not diplomats. They were beasts wrapped in armor and blood, their presence a promise of extinction. None challenged them without being broken, until her. She came not from the core systems, but from a world so hostile it was classified by the Galactic Archive as incompatible with sustained organic life. Deathworld 7, a wind-swept wasteland of sulfur storms and gravity fractures. The inhabitants had no name for themselves. They were too busy surviving. But the galaxy had named them Deathworlders, a term spat from trembling tongues, half in awe, half in fear. Their biology defied reason. Their endurance laughed in the face of natural law. They were walking contradictions to the fragile norms of sentient life. She didn't look like a warrior. That was the first thing everyone noticed. Slender, almost fragile by apex standards, her stature failed to cast a shadow long enough to match her legend. Skin marked with the pale traceries of environmental scars, eyes a too bright amber from low-light adaptation, and movements that flowed like water over coiled springs. The file said her name was Reza, 9, though whether that was a code, designation, or simply her own choice, no one knew. Her reputation arrived before she did. A Deathworlder who had walked unharmed through a plasma storm, negotiated ceasefires between feral merc tribes, and killed an Apex commander with nothing but her voice. It wasn't the Apex warlord's idea to meet with her. He did not entertain negotiations, certainly not with subspecies. But this meeting wasn't his decision. The Galactic Accord, an exhausted and largely symbolic coalition, had convened a final summit in a last-ditch effort to prevent total planetary cullings in the Outer Ring. The warlord agreed to attend, perhaps amused, perhaps curious to see what creature dared waste his time. No one expected diplomacy. No one expected anything beyond the usual. Threats, refusal, maybe an execution if things became amusing. And yet, when Reza 9 stepped into the chamber, the warlord paused. He towered over her, his exoskeletal plating radiating heat. He wore no translator. He had never needed one. His voice alone bent lesser minds. But something about her made him hesitate. Not fear. Not yet. But the atmosphere shifted, subtle and sharp, like gravity realigning. The chamber was round, stark, embedded into the heart of the neutral moon station of Virex Theta. A circle of delegates surrounded them, many watching through glass that was one way, but not soundproof. Every breath, every whisper would be recorded, analyzed, disseminated. The moment would live forever. She said nothing. Instead, she stepped into circle. No weapons, no armor, no protective visor. Only a slim filament glinted at her temple. A neural stabilizer, tuned to block psychic feedback. Custom-built, likely by her own hand. Her gaze met his without flinching, not in defiance nor submission. It was like watching two storms regard each other from across a canyon. The warlord tilted his head. "You came to beg," he said finally, voice thick with barbed vowels. The sound warped the chamber slightly. "Begging is inefficient. Your species will burn, one world at a time. You may speak your last request." She blinked once. The stabilizer clicked softly. The filament glowed, then dimmed, but her lips did not move. Silence. 1 second. 2. The warlord narrowed his eyes. He leaned forward. "Speak." She did not. 3 seconds. 4. A ripple passed through the observers, many unsure if this was a tactic or a malfunction. 5. The warlord's fingers flexed. His claws dragged faint grooves into the floor. He was used to noise, screams, protests, lies. Silence unsettled him. It forced introspection, something he had no practice in. 6. She simply watched him, not as prey to predator, but as an equal, or worse, as something inevitable. 7. 8. His armor pulsed as he prepared a threat. Still, her silence coiled around the moment like smoke. There was no fear in her posture, no plea, no challenge. 9. The delegates began to shift. Some leaned forward, unsure whether to intervene or document. 10. His breathing grew shallow. 11. The silence became unbearable. It screamed louder than any weapon. He had never felt so seen. 12. The warlord's jaw twitched. A small step back. Not enough to be obvious, but it was there. 13. He looked away. That was all. The chamber erupted, not in chaos, but in a stunned collective inhalation. The warlord, whose name had meant death in dozens of languages, had faltered. No words, no blood, just silence. And she had won. Reza 9 turned. Without a word, she left the circle. The news spread before her footsteps faded from the chamber. Across systems, across battlefronts, across bunkers and palaces and refugee ships, they watched the footage again and again. 13 seconds. 13 seconds that shattered a legacy of terror. She didn't speak because she didn't need to. And for the first time in the Apex Dominion's reign, silence meant defeat. But the war was not over. Not yet. Silence was a message. Now, they had to decide how to answer it. They called it the Choral, a convergence point for the most powerful minds and most destructive egos in the galaxy. It was never meant to host a confrontation. It was designed for declarations, not dialogues. Yet now it had become a stage for something far more primal. A reckoning that transcended language, a moment that balanced on the edge of a silence too sharp to ignore. The Apex warlord entered first, flanked by his honor guard, hulking monstrosities clad in living armor, more ritual than necessity. No one would dare lay a hand on him. Not here, not anywhere. His presence was a tectonic force, magnetic in its cruelty, gravitational in its menace. Delegates seated in the upper tiers leaned away as he passed. The air tasted metallic, as if it had absorbed too many screams in too short a time. He walked with the assurance of a being who had never been told no. Then the chamber shifted. Reza 9's arrival made no sound. No armored escort, no dramatic entrance. She simply appeared at the far end of the room, a breath drawn through the shadows. Her silhouette was stark against the white cord light pouring from the central dome. She moved like gravity bent toward her, not through force, but inevitability. Delegates leaned forward, uncertain whether to marvel or recoil. The warlord turned to her, and for a fleeting instant his brow creased. Confusion? Curiosity? He would never admit to either. She stepped into the core hall's central zone, a circle engraved with emblems of 1,000 treaties, most long broken. This was the arbitration ring. In tradition, it was a space of truth, where no species could lie without consequence. But today, it was simply the place where legend would either fracture or be forged. They faced one another. No words had been exchanged. None would be. The warlord's voice, when it came, was low and sardonic. Is this the part where your species pleads for mercy? Or has the death world finally accepted extinction? Reza 9 didn't answer. She tilted her head slightly, as if studying a fossilized predator. Her eyes gleamed, not with hostility, but with a kind of distant surgical precision. The chamber held its breath. The first second passed. A strange stillness settled. Then the second and third. Delegates blinked. A few shifted uncomfortably. They had expected a confrontation of screams and fury. Not this vacuum, this silence that had shape and temperature and purpose. At 5 seconds, the warlord laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was a laugh of collapsing cities and shattered orbital stations. But it was laced with a tremor he didn't understand. 6 seconds. She did not flinch. He stepped forward, his shadow swallowing hers. The biomechanical plates of his armor realigned, exhaling heat and malice. He leaned closer, teeth bared. You will speak, or I will take the words from you. Still nothing. 8 seconds. Her gaze remained fixed, unblinking. There was no challenge in her expression, no arrogance, only presence. Complete, unyielding, impenetrable. 9. Somewhere above, a translator stuttered, uncertain whether to register a conversation or a malfunction. 10. The warlord's nostrils flared. His breathing changed, shallow and quickened. He wasn't used to being looked at like that. Not by prey. Not by anything without a weapon. But her stillness was not submission. It was not even defiance. It was domination by an entirely different method. 11. He took another step forward, but it felt like retreat. Each movement exposed him. Her silence was not passive. It was dissecting him atom by atom. 12. His jaw shifted. The ferocity in his eyes flickered. Something ancient inside him, a predator's instinct, whispered of danger not yet named. And that was the moment. 13. He broke eye contact. The chamber didn't erupt. It froze. An entire galactic council paralyzed by the impossibility of what they had just witnessed. The warlord, whose legacy had been carved in orbital strikes and planetary subjugation, had looked away first, not out of strategy, not out of calculation, but because for the first time in his reign, someone had stripped him down without laying a hand on him. Reza, 9 stepped back, not in retreat, but in release. Whatever passed between them had been decided. She turned without a word. She did not gloat. She did not linger. Delegates sat stunned, their neural feeds buzzing with interpretations, theories, absurd rewinds of the footage. Even the Apex guards faltered, unsure whether to intervene or stay still. The warlord stood alone in the arbitration ring, his expression unreadable. He didn't leave immediately. He stared at the spot where she had stood, as if the silence still echoed. And in a way it did. That silence traveled. It bled through hyperspace transmissions, through military chain of commands, through resistance channels and propaganda networks. It was shared, dissected, misunderstood, weaponized. But everyone felt it. 13 seconds. A Deathworlder had unraveled, a warlord with silence alone. The following day, the Apex forces halted expansion on 3 front lines. No orders were given. No explanations followed. It just stopped. Reza, 9, disappeared. Or rather, she stepped off the public stage. Some said she returned to Deathworld. 7. Others believed she had been reassigned to classified operations. A few insisted she never existed, that she was a weaponized myth, a holographic construct designed to destabilize the Apex from within. But those who had been in the core hall knew the truth. She was real, and she had won. But victory, in this galaxy, was never permanent. The silence had opened a fracture in the fabric of power. And somewhere deep in the Dominion's core sectors, warlords met in hushed tones. They didn't speak of vengeance. Not yet. They spoke of understanding, of fear, of a kind of war they did not know how to fight. Reza, 9, had changed something fundamental, not just in her enemy, in everyone. And it was only the beginning. The silence had done what fleets could not. It had slipped past shields, bypassed armor, and lodged itself in a seat of fear, the mind. In the hours following Reza 9's confrontation with the Apex warlord, the galaxy rippled with interpretations. None of them complete, none of them dismissive. What had happened was too stark, too precise. It wasn't the absence of speech that had undone the warlord. It was the fullness of something else, something not yet named. Military analysts flooded the channels, trying to frame the moment in tactical terms. They called it psychological deterrence, post-verbal confrontation, empathic disruption. No term sufficed. The Apex Dominion, historically immune to diplomacy and resistant to all but direct force, had found no metric for silence as a weapon. For the first time in recorded Dominion history, the warlord had issued no response, not a single retaliation order, not even a communique to frame the event in their favor. He had retreated, not from the chamber, but from the narrative. Reza 9's actions were scrutinized frame by frame. Her posture, her breathing, the tilt of her head. Some suggested she had employed a neural dampening field that affected only Apex physiology. Others posited subtle quantum signaling, unmeasurable, but neurologically persuasive. But every analysis missed the obvious. She hadn't used technology. She hadn't transmitted threat. She had projected certainty. The Apex Empire, built on dominance, had encountered something it could not overawe. Conviction without ego. Silence without fear. In the outer systems, Soldiers stationed on occupation fronts began to report strange behavior among their apex commanders. Delays in decision-making, brief hesitations, moments where once ruthless orders were paused, reconsidered. The warlord's moment of weakness had not been seen as a loss by many of his own, but as a signal. If the Deathworlder had found a new kind of power, then perhaps they should, too. Dominion psychology, rigid and brutal, was not built for introspection. Now, a fracture had formed. Reza, 9 herself, remained inaccessible. The Accord claimed she had returned to Deathworld 7. No one believed it. What mattered more was what she represented, not where she was. In a galaxy drunk on domination, she had performed restraint so total it became the sharpest act of force. It redefined strength not as escalation, but as self-possession. Across systems, symbols emerged. A silhouette or profile, eyes forward, lips closed. A circle around her, signifying the arbitration ring. The image found its way into resistance walls, noble family crests, back alley tattoos, even children's stories. Some called her the Quiet Flame. Others whispered Nullblade, an idea rather than a name, a weapon that cut without impact. But not all responded with awe. Within the Dominion, among Apex loyalists and militant scholars, her silence became an existential threat. They couldn't replicate it. They couldn't defend against it. She hadn't humiliated the warlord. She had exposed a fault line in their species-wide psyche. They began to train response units specifically to counter nonverbal confrontation. Simulation labs were constructed to replicate the moment, to deconstruct it, but each trial ended the same way: confusion, unease, and eventual withdrawal. They were trying to answer poetry with protocol, and all the while Reza, 9, remained silent. Those who knew her before the Coral incident, if such people existed, offered little insight. She had no documented ties to any military, no visible political alignment. Some believed she was a product of an Accord Black project, raised to be the galaxy's most effective psychological weapon. Others believed she was a rogue philosopher, someone who had simply seen too much and decided to fight war not with tactics, but with presence. The truth was simpler. She had survived more than the warlord could imagine. Her world had tested her in ways that made combat feel ornamental. Deathworld 7 did not reward strength. It demanded adaptability. It punished noise. On a world where sound meant vulnerability, silence became the first language of survival. What had unraveled the warlord wasn't magic. It was understanding. She knew him better than he knew himself. She recognized the void behind his fury, the brittle pride beneath his violence, and she didn't need to expose it to others. She simply let him feel it, alone, unadorned. Some argue that silence could not end war, that it was a tactic, not a solution. They were right. The Dominion had not fallen. Battles still flared. Cruelty still reigned in too many systems. But something had shifted. The inevitability was gone. The story had changed. And in conflict, stories mattered more than numbers. A week after the Core Hall encounter, a strange event occurred on the war-torn moon of Ilexis 4. An Apex strike team arrived to suppress a rebellion. They disembarked, lined up, weapons drawn. The rebels stood in silence, unarmed, arranged in concentric circles. At the center stood a woman cloaked in heat-resistant silk, her lips closed, her eyes steady. She was not Reza, 9, but she did not need to be. The strike team did not fire. The warlord watched this unfold through remote feeds. He had spoken to no one since Coral. No orders, no speeches, not even to his own advisors. He sat in a dark chamber aboard his flagship, the symbols of his authority untouched, his weapons locked in their sheaths. What stirred inside him was not defeat, but curiosity, dangerous curiosity. The Deathworlder had not defeated him. She had changed the battlefield. And deep beneath his cold, weaponized intellect, the warlord began to understand. The next war would not be fought with ships. It would be fought with presence, with silence, with whatever was that had happened in those 13 seconds that still echoed inside his skull. He did not fear her. Not yet, but he could no longer ignore her. And that was the beginning of something far more dangerous than fear. The Dominion had always depended on rhythm, violence as ritual, conquest as cadence. Worlds fell in predictable patterns, their screens charted like star maps. But after the Coral incident, something dissonant had entered that rhythm. It was not rebellion, not resistance. It was interruption. That silence, those 13 seconds, had grown, not in volume, but in weight. And the weight was dragging everything down. The apex warlord had not spoken publicly in weeks. Whispers said he was undergoing recalibration. Others believed he had fallen into the chrysalis state, a dangerous form of strategic hibernation practiced only by apex leaders during paradigm crises. The truth was harder to find. He had not shut down. He had slowed. He studied. Each day, he reviewed the footage. Reza 9's stance, her stillness. He memorized the tension of her silence, as if decoding a new kind of syntax. His advisors begged him to issue a declaration. He refused. Orders to retaliate remained unsigned. He dismissed the firestorm within the Dominion as irrelevant noise. In reality, he knew anything he said would sound like reaction, and he had never been reactive. He had always been inevitable. Until her. Meanwhile, Reza 9 did not vanish, but neither did she surface. She moved like gravity through the outer systems, silent but undeniable. She never repeated the tactic. She didn't need to. Rumor carried her better than light. Resistance movements invoked her not with slogans, but gestures. Closed lips, palm raised. Her presence had become mythology before anyone could co-opt it. She gave no speeches. She joined no council. She did what silence does best. She allowed others to hear themselves. On Nyranex 5, a mining colony turned war zone, apex suppressors arrived to quell a strike. A lone figure met them at the access gates. Thin, unarmed, face covered by a translucent mask, marked with razor silhouette. The lead suppressor hesitated. He didn't know if it was her. That was enough. The strike continued. No one was executed. Fear had changed shape. Yet Reza 9 was no pacifist. Silence was not surrender. It was selection. She chose her moments. When Apex vessels began abducting civilians on the edges of Accord space, one such ship vanished mid-jump. No distress signal, no explosion. Just gone. Days later. Footage leaked from a corridor within the Dominion dreadnought Shriek of Iron. It showed Reza 9 walking calmly past scorched Apex corpses, a single filament pulsing at her temple. No weapons drawn. Just her. The footage lasted 13 seconds. The warlord watched it again and again. What unsettled him was not the death. It was the rhythm. Her movements matched the Coral incident. He began to suspect she wasn't improvising. She was conducting. Her every gesture, every second, choreographed. This wasn't silence as absence. It was silence as language. He began to prepare. In the sanctum of his flagship, the warlord constructed a chamber modeled after the arbitration ring. Every detail exact. He trained inside it, alone, standing for hours in silence, facing projections, facing himself. He spoke less. He slept less. But he grew more still. Not calmer, more compressed. Like a star preparing collapse. He studied Reza's history, or what little of it had surfaced. She had once been a planetary engineer, specialized in stress-tolerant materials. Not a soldier, not a spy, a constructor of things designed to endure. The irony settled slowly. She had spent her youth building foundations, not destroying them. And now, she was unraveling empires. Still, the warlord was not afraid. Not truly. What stirred in him was stranger, a hunger, not for vengeance, for understanding. She had reached something beyond war, and he, bred by violence, shaped by doctrine, had no access to it until he created it. He issued an invitation, not to the Accord, not to any council, to her directly. No weapons, no witnesses, just the two of them. A rematch, but not of fists, of presence. It was madness, and yet it was accepted. They met again, this time on a drifting neutral station near the starless rift of Kael'kar. No guards, no recordings, no weapons, just an empty chamber, white, sterile, humming with the faint resonance of stabilized vacuum. Reza, 9, stepped in first, her expression unreadable. The filament at her temple faintly flickered, but she made no motion. She stood, hands loose at her sides, gaze steady. The warlord entered. No armor, no entourage, only a simple mantle of interwoven glyph metal across his chest, decorative, historical, symbolic. They faced each other, closer than before, a single step between them. He spoke first. "What did you see that day?" She didn't answer. Instead, the silence began. 1 second. 2. The warlord did not falter. Not this time. He matched her gaze. He had trained for this, prepared, built up mental resistances. Silence was no longer foreign. 3, 4. His breath slowed. He centered himself. 5, 6. And then it happened, not to her, to him. In the quiet, he heard his own thoughts, unfiltered, unarmored. Regret, rage, loneliness, the primal knowledge that everything he had ever conquered had been noise. Distraction. He had never known stillness, because stillness revealed. And now, it revealed him to himself. 7, 8. The silence did not attack. It enveloped, not a blade, an atmosphere. 9. He remembered his first kill. Not the glory, but the smell, the weight of a jawbone cracking under his gauntlet. And he wondered, for the first time, had that been strength or was escape? 10, 11. Reza did not move, but her presence filled the space entirely. 12. He felt something unthinkable, not submission, recognition. 13. He blinked, and for the first time he exhaled, not as a warlord, but as something less defined, something more real. She stepped back, gently. The silence, now complete, dissolved, and she left. This time, he did not watch her go. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his lids, he saw not conquest, but questions. Across the galaxy, the Apex Dominion shifted again. Orders were rewritten. Campaigns paused. Within weeks, peace envoys were deployed to minor systems long considered worthless, not because they had resources, but because they had stories. And in those stories, told around dying stars and reborn hopes, a girl from a death world had shown the most dangerous warlord in history something no one else could. The power not to destroy, but to stop, to listen, to remain. And in that act, she didn't end war. She made a different future possible.